This is Dan Bolen. I'd like to welcome you to my podcast, The Courage to Be Courageous, where people from all over the United States can come and hear stories of people who have faced their fear and have the courage to come through their fear. We want to encourage our audience to think about the importance of fear in our lives. And most of us have fear at some time in our life. It's a natural thing, but so is courage. So our podcast is to help people not run from courage, but to rather not run from fear, but embrace their fear and use courage to be able to do that. I think we have an excellent guest today, and he's one that I got to enjoy here in San Diego. Now, I'm going to spell his name because I slaughter the pronunciation, and he's going to give you the correct one. So it's Andrew, and it's Suozzo. I'm going to say Andrew Suozzo. I'm sure I messed it up.
That's exactly how my family has anglicized it. If we were Italian, we'd say Suozzo, but Suozzo is fine.
So. Okay, that sounds great. And Andy is a part of our Frontrunners group here in San Diego. First of all, I want to be able to establish his age. He's 77 years old. And I always say we're 39 and holding for many, many years, but 77 years old is the truth. So let's tell us a little bit about your life, Andrew. Obviously, you and I were raised in the same generation, and we know how difficult, almost impossible it was to come out as our authentic selves during that period of time. But tell me a little bit about when you experienced same-sex attraction and what it was like with you back in the time you and I grew up, which would have been many, many years ago. We're both in our 70s, so people can identify the generation that we were in. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I think I experienced same-sex attraction at about the age of 12, and that when I was reading my Boys' Life magazines and things like that. But I didn't understand it that way. I didn't even know there was such a thing as same-sex attraction. And I only discovered that it existed and that it was a terrible thing for most people in my religion class in Catholic high school, when the notion of then homosexuality was explained, and that sent me into very deep shock because I didn't have any doubts about my sexual orientation at that point. I knew it was very clear. I knew I liked women or girls at that point, but I was not sexually attracted to them, and I knew that was the case. And I wanted that to change, but there was nothing I could do about it. It was.
Now, there was one of your teachers made a comment that was really very distressful and very harmful for you. Do you remember what he said?
Yes, I remember it to this day. As he got on to the subject, he said, I don't know if I really need to bother talking about this subject because there's no one in this class who is so foul, so unmanly, or so disgusting. And lo and behold, I realized that I was one of those people. And it was deeply shocking. And also for me at the time, as a devout Catholic, I realized that any consent in desire, which would be technically a sin of desire, it would be a mortal sin, which would condemn me to hell. So this frightened me very much as a 13-year-old and discouraged me. And it certainly didn't prompt me to discuss the issue. I had no knowledge of gay life or anything at that point. And I imagine that I was maybe one of less than 10 gay people in all of New Jersey. So when I was growing up, the 8 million people or so there. So to me, it seemed like a horrific state, and it made me into an instant pariah. And it was very hard to live with.
So you basically became silent.
Well, there was nothing to say. I just focused on my studies. And then when haphazardly I discovered that I was actually a very competitive runner, I also focused on sports. Previously, I had thought my only saving attributes were academic abilities, but then I could add athletics to it. It was sort of a way of protecting myself. I think running, because in those days, nobody would ever believe that a gay person could be competent as an athlete. The being a track star, I guess, was my shield of honor.
Now, it's interesting because at one time, didn't you make a comment, I believe, that you thought about the priesthood, but you felt you were too unworthy for that?
Yeah. As soon as I realized what my sexual orientation was, I demoted myself. I said the only form of religious orders I could take would be becoming a brother, which is a lower rank. You can't consecrate the host or anything like that. So, and that held for about 2 years because I already had doubts about my religion in eighth grade before I went to high school. And eventually, I think when I was late in sophomore year, early junior year, I was having a discussion with my closest friend who was a militant atheist in our Catholic school. And we were discussing the existence of God and the truth of the church and all that. And it just sort of hit me. It was a kind of epiphany, a reverse epiphany, if you want, that I didn't believe any of this. And at that point, I no longer accepted any religious condemnations of homosexuality, but I realized that I lived in a society that was utterly unfriendly to who I was, and that though I might someday act on my impulses, I would have to act with the greatest caution.
Now, did you at that time did you talk to anybody about your sexual orientation at all, or was it just you by yourself?
No, I think I probably told my mother when I was about to graduate from high school, and my mother was very supportive. She just said I was her son, and whoever I was, that was fine with her. And she thought that maybe my feelings would change when I got to college and got out of an all-boys school. They didn't, but she did. She didn't hold them against me. Oh, sorry. Um,
Well, I think that was courageous. You came out to your mom,
well,
and she was accepting of you.
we got along.
How about your dad?
I had a very tense relationship with my father. He was often verbally and physically abusive, particularly to my mother, and I was the oldest of five sons. So I was the one who was most in conflict with him. He had good qualities too. He was not reactionary on sexual issues, but I just didn't want to share this with him because I didn't want to give him a potential weapon against me. So when later on it was made clear to him that who I was, etc., he was still supportive. So
Oh, he was supportive.
yeah, well, he was supportive in a way that I could have done without, because he'd discuss things like Mayor Koch at work, but he'd say, I couldn't be too supportive of the mayor because it might compromise you. And I said, I'm grown up. I make my own choices. You're really trying to control me by, in quotes, protecting me. And but in any case, I really couldn't complain about his attitudes. He, like I think both of my parents, but my father in particular, just thought it was irrational to persecute people on the basis of desires that they couldn't turn off or change. He thought it was simply foolish and stupid to do. So not everybody was crazy back in
Yeah, well, he gave you as much support evidently as he could at the time there too.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Andrew, let's talk about your scholastic achievements, because I think, and we're going to talk about his running, because I'm telling you, my podcasters, this guy is one of the most awesome runners I've ever seen. We're going to talk about how good he is here in just a minute. But let's tell us about your scholastic achievements. And I think you you first started at Iona College, correct?
Yeah, just for a year. And then I transferred to McGill University. And I had a full scholarship at Iona, but Iona was in those days rigidly Catholic. And I told my parents I needed to be away from that atmosphere. And fortunately, I was able to transfer to McGill University in Montreal, which is one of Canada's best universities. And it also had the added advantage of being very inexpensive compared to American universities. I gave up a full scholarship to Iona to go there, but so I was able to, and my father was generous in supporting me. And in those days, college cost a lot more, a lot less, excuse me, proportionately than it does now anyway. And McGill was already at bargain basement prices. So it worked out very good economically. I got a first honors degree in European history and went on to graduate school at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, where I changed concentrations to French literature, and I got an MA and a PhD in French lit.
So you got your PhD at the University of Pennsylvania. Mm-hmm. And then you became a professor. You started teaching for many years, I believe.
Yes.
Over 40 years, is that correct?
I think I started teaching in my late 20s as a graduate student, and then I finished my full-time teaching in, I think 2014. So that's fairly long time, when I was 67 or 68. So, a good 40 years of teaching.
Excellent. Now let's talk about your running, because obviously, as many of us who are struggling with who we are for some time, we become overachievers. Mm-hmm. We try to make ourselves, we overachieve everything. We want to be the best of who we can. A lot of overachievement above that. Part of it's because of what we're dealing with ourselves. But let's talk about your running, because I think this is fascinating, and I want my podcasters to hear about it. When you first started running, and especially when you started running marathons, Andrew, tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I actually stopped running in high school, and I only resumed running when I was just about to turn 50 in an attempt to control or retain my success at dieting. So I came back to Chicago after a stint in Paris. And one of my friends said, "Why don't you join the front runners?" And I was intimidated. I thought these would be serious runners. I would never be able to keep up with them. And the first day I ran with them, I realized that I was already relatively quick within that group, and there was nothing to be embarrassed about. There wouldn't have been anything to be embarrassed about, even if I had been very slow. They're very accepting and welcoming. But I imagined it differently. So in any case, after about 2 weeks, I ran a half marathon, did fairly well in that. And I thought, gee, I'd like to run a marathon before I'm 50. So I signed up for the Chicago Marathon, which in those days wasn't hard to register for even the night before the race. And with great trepidation, I ran the Chicago Marathon, far from my best time, but a good enough time to qualify for Boston and to inspire me to aim higher, because I think I'd run in like 3:21 without training for the race, with my longest runs being 7 miles. And I thought, you can get below 3 hours. And indeed, I did. It took me about 3 years of struggling, but I managed to get there. And I was very active in running in general, not just marathons, but all sorts of races. Chicago has a wonderful organization called the Chicago Area Runners Association, and it's a kind of umbrella organization that groups all the running clubs, including front runners, in its association, and it organizes these annual series of an annual circuit of races. That's what I was searching for, in which you compete for points, and eventually, if you work your way up, it takes quite a number of years, you can score enough points to be inducted into their Hall of Fame, which I have been inducted into. But in any case, I ran.
So you're inducted into the Hall of Fame.
The Chicago Area Runners Association Hall of Fame.
Hall of Fame.
It's a big association.
That's impressive. That is impressive.
Well, it's an all-point thing, so it takes a while, and I have suffered many injuries and setbacks on my way there, but I finally got there. And through the marathons, I ran them until my mid-60s, and then I decided I was having far too many physical injuries, and that I would stop, and I took 10 years off, and in 2022, just out of curiosity, I ran the LA Marathon and I won my age group within a very modest time.
Okay, so in 2022, you were 10 years off, and then in 2022, you came back. So that would have made you then 76?
Yeah.
Correct, right?
Yeah.
So you came off of 10 years, came back at 76, and you run your age group and win your age group at 76. And I believe that year at 2022, you actually did 3 marathons at 76.
I did.
Is that correct?
76 and 77, because I
turned okay. I
didn't
want to take that year away from you. No, yeah. Well, that's impressive.
So I ran LA, and then I ran New York, and then I ran Tucson. And I was thrilled to win my age group in New York. I did not expect it. It was really, it was for me the greatest victory I could have throughout my entire life of running. And then I ran Tucson, which I won, and I expected to because there was very little competition. But at my age, the number of people in an age group tends to be very small. And so I was happy with New York because it had 61 people versus about 20 in Los Angeles and 2 in Tucson. So you really...
Yeah. And you won them all 3.
Yeah.
And your age group.
Yeah, it was very nice. It was unexpected. And then I got involved with this association for older runners. You can't join it unless you're at least 75 years old and an active marathon runner, which eliminates about 99.999% of humanity.
I agree with that. Very small percentage, but a very elite percentage. That's incredible. And I thought this was so fascinating when I was talking to Andrew yesterday when we were going over some of this information. I think when you run the New York Marathon, which you didn't, was that the one that you beat the closest competitor by an hour?
No, that was LA.
That was LA. Okay, tell us about that.
That told me that I should consider running more, and then I looked up times in major marathons, and though I was not at all thrilled with my time in LA, I realized I was still in the running from that.
Like you were 1 hour ahead of your closest competitor.
Yeah, that was unexpected. I mean, if there had been really strong competition, I might have ended up third with a person 2 minutes behind me. But that sort of that left me aghast when I.
Yeah. Well, that's wonderful, though. It shows how well you were doing. Sometimes we do better than we think we do.
Indeed. But I still have the terrible cramps when I run. So I'm always wondering whether towards mile 20 or afterwards, my legs are just going to seize up. I've found some solutions to that, not complete solutions, but I carry packets of BioFreeze, and it seems to work when I can't move. I put it on my leg.
Oh, wow. That is amazing. Now, let's talk about that. So I want my podcasters to really understand what we're saying here. He's ran 3 marathons at 76 and 77, the New York Marathon, obviously the LA Marathon, and the Tucson Marathon. Now, you're also training for another marathon right now, aren't you?
Yeah, well, I just ran Boston in the spring, not very well because I had an Achilles tendon issue, and I'm training for the Chicago Marathon on the 8th of October, I think it is.
So you're going to be running the Chicago Marathon the 8th of October.
Right.
Isn't that a real dynamic, really? Isn't that one of the top marathons in the United States?
Well, in the world, it's one of the 6 marathon majors that's sponsored by Abbott. And there's a huge competition surrounding that in age groups and all the rest. And this time it's the premier race for the Abbott World Competition. So it's going to be rough. I'll be happy to do a good time, and I'm not worrying about place there. I mean, I have a long connection with Chicago, and I've run a number of Chicago marathons, and I also wrote a book about the Chicago Marathon. It was my last book. And I know the race director. I know lots of people involved with the race. And of course, I spent 30 years in Chicago. So it's really a home race for me, even though I live in Palm Springs and San Diego these days. So it's a big deal for me. I want to at least move well. The last time I ran it, I placed second in, I think, the 60 to 64-year-old group. Actually, most years it wouldn't be that tough to go for a first, but this year I don't think so. The world champion is there, so but it will be fun. I just want to aim for a good time and good pace and enjoy the course because in the 4 marathons I've run the past slightly over a year, this is the only marathon that's relatively flat, and I would put in quotes easy. No marathon is easy, but this one is torturous. And, yeah.
Fantastic. Wow. Well, it's the number one runner in the world is going to be at the Boston Marathon. What'll be interesting, we won't be around to know this, wants to know if he'll be running a marathon when he's 77, like you are. My hat's off to you, Andrew. My hat's off to you.
People can do it.
I know they can. Yeah, I'm a runner, a former runner, but I'm more of a short-term runner. I think I think I did a half marathon once. And I remember doing it, and I was so tired. It was like, oh my gosh, I don't think I could do a full marathon. But you got to train for it, and I get that. I don't do marathons or any half marathons anymore. I'm more of a fast-paced dash runner, that type of thing. But let's talk for a minute about about the book that you wrote about Chicago Marathon. Tell us a little bit. What's the name of the book, and what's it about?
Well, the name is pretty simple. It's the Chicago Marathon.
Okay.
And it came out with the University of Illinois Press. It was an attempt to understand the marathon kind of as a machine, the cultural phenomena, the various phenomena that had made marathon running into a mass event. So I wanted to look at it not as a traditional sports book, but the first chapter I dealt with, why people suddenly began to run a race that's so arduous. And that was when it was first invented in 1896, I think, for the first Olympics, was really a race that inspired a lot of interest. But there was about the 20 years following that Olympics, there were races all over the country and all over the world. But if they had a field of 100, that was gigantic. Now we're talking about fields of 45,000 runners. So the explosion really started to occur in the 60s. And I was interested in a lot of the cultural factors that were very significant in it. The marathon is sort of a model for the urban elite, long-term planning, discipline. It's almost like a banker or investor's model. People are challenging aging. So, there are a lot of people who are turning 40 or 50 who want to prove that they're still alive and kicking. So they decide to run a marathon because it has all this sort of prestige for endurance, and that it's one of the great epic endeavors that human beings can engage in without going to war and killing other people. And it allows them to have a great sense of accomplishment. And of course, it does involve a lot of suffering, but it's also a civic rite. I think it's substituted for a lot of the religious processions that used to cement urban unity in old Europe and all the rest. There's also the entry of women into running, et cetera. There's so many things. I just can't go into it all now, but the first chapter was to look at the cultural changes that had transformed this race from a tiny 100-person race, usually 100-man race, into a 45,000 person race. So that was fascinating for me. Then I looked at the history of Chicago itself, its runners, the aid stations, how they recruit volunteers, press coverage, and the city itself, how it was engaged in planning and that. So what I wanted was really a book that gave a portrait of how a modern mass marathon was organized and what it meant to the city of Chicago, which I think represents fairly well the aspirations of many cities that have large marathons.
Wow. And now the name of that book is The Chicago Marathon
Mm-hmm.
by Andrew
Suozzo.
Suozzo, Suozzo. Can they get that on Amazon or Goodread?
Oh yeah, it's the University Press, University of Illinois Press publication, 2006, and it's on Amazon. Really, yeah.
It'd be fantastic for people that are runners to learn about the history of the Chicago Marathon. And because many of our podcasters may be looking at or have done the Chicago Marathon, I think it would be a very fascinating story.
Well, I'd have to update the chapter because I'm about 10 years behind that. Most in 2006, I'm 17 years behind.
That's okay. To tell us, you've also written two other books.
Yeah, the first book was a sort of standard academic book. It was called The Comic Novels of Suozzocourage. It was a French 17th century comic author who really was more, he sort of is a precursor of the Enlightenment with his critique of norms, and that a lot of the 17th century in France reinforces royal power and more absolutist ideals, but this author didn't. So he appealed to me. And then after that, I had written co-authored a pedagogical book on teaching French culture theory and practice with an Australian writer, Ross Steele. And I've written a bunch of, lots of articles and other things, a lot of articles on different subjects, including running and literature and pedagogy. So that's about the mix.
Wow, you're fascinating. Fascinating. You're not only a great runner, you're very intelligent, obviously, and have done some great work.
I find runners, sociologically, it's a sport that attracts very well educated people. And for instance, the group I'm with of these older runners, there's a hyperabundance of Harvard professors, PhDs, MDs, et cetera. It's almost as if you needed an advanced degree to be part of this group.
Why is that, Andrew? Do you think? Why is it?
I think there are a lot of things with running. You could be an aggressive runner, but it doesn't have the aggressiveness and violence of, say, football, which doesn't appeal to a lot of educated people, that aspect of it, at least. It's also a very kind of disciplined sport that you can practice throughout life. And I think it's something that an academic person can manage very easily, or a well-educated person can, especially people who have flexibility in their working hours. You can do that. You don't, although it's nice to run with a club and that, you can always do it by yourself whenever it's needed. But it just seems to, I think it's sort of, while there's plenty of fellowship in it, it lacks a lot of the machismo of many sports, which sort of turns off educated people, I think, a lot, because they sort of identify machismo and stupidity.
Really interesting. That's an interesting comment.
Yeah, well, I think it's often a fair one, but and you could be really tough, aggressive runner, but it's a different kind of toughness. It's an endurance, it's resolution. It's not a lot of stupid preening and things like that. At least that's the way I view it. So maybe other people don't. But that's the way it goes. And because I remember when I was writing my first article on the Chicago Marathon, I called it Chicago Marathon and Urban Renaissance. I was looking at this French sociologist, very famous one, Pierre Bourdieu, and he was talking about runners, and he identified them with working class people, and that, which was true until about the 70s. And I was looking at his analysis, and it was now so inappropriate to the kind of stereotypical portrait I would make of a contemporary runner. And so there was a big shift in about the 70s. So we just have a different kind. There's a different kind of ethos that pervades running, especially with the entry of women too, which was an epic battle in itself and a fascinating history. But I think that also gives a different feel to the sport because everyone is running together, even though they don't finish at the same time. And it gives, I think, a more universal aspect or a more comprehensive aspect.
Now, when you first started running marathons, were women running at that time?
Oh yes, by the 80s, especially thanks to New York, which was always opened, I think, as of the 70s to women, and Boston gave way. I think it was in the early 80s, or was it the 70s? My memory doesn't serve me well at this moment. But by well into the 80s, women started becoming very numerous in sports and running. And in Chicago, even when I was running in the 90s, I think something like 40% of runners were women. And
that's
been, yeah, and Chicago has been exceptionally open that way. But I find it a very good thing. I like the idea that everybody is in sport and people can run at their own speeds, and it's an event that has different values for different people, but it's sort of like a great urban celebration. And the cities like New York and Chicago, with their actual marathon courses, tend to link various parts of the city, so it becomes a kind of symbolic expression of urban unity. It's a very interesting race.
Excellent. Now, let's talk a little bit about the generation that you and I were raised in. Of course, I was in the closet all those years and using work addiction and religious addiction. But you were, of course, knew you were gay, and you came through the time when the AIDS crisis went on. And how did that affect you, Andrew, in your situation?
Well, I mean, when the AIDS crisis just started happening, I was newly employed. I moved to a job in Chicago to DePaul University. I wasn't formally out. I don't think I've ever formally come out. I've just done things that made it clear who I am. But the crisis, at first, I felt a sense of alarm and concern. I had asked my doctor about it, and he poo-pooed it. Later on, he changed his tune. But it caused me great anxiety, great fear, especially initially when we weren't sure how the disease was transmitted and what you could or couldn't do. So you didn't really have any kind of secure guideline. I really very much wanted to find somebody and have a permanent partner. That really didn't work out. The one partner I did have, sort of off and on. I was away in the summer. He told me when I came back, that he had contracted AIDS, and fortunately, he died.
And he was your partner. He was your partner at one time.
Well, sort of. He was somebody I saw regularly. We didn't live together, and I don't know how to describe. He was on. I don't want to use a vulgar term, but he was somebody with whom I have an ongoing physical relationship.
Right.
But I don't know, partner was the right word. But in any case, he didn't make it, and many of the people I knew didn't make it. And throughout the 80s, it was a time of real fear of dying. It impacted a lot of my behavior. Like I didn't invest properly in stocks for my retirement because I thought I might be getting ill and would need to be able to pull my money from something regular and mundane like a fixed interest account. And that, fortunately, I never needed to do that. But it had a lot of impact on very mundane or very important things, and also. Throughout my much of my adult life, I was heavy smoker. And when
Oh, I did not know that. You
I
were?
used to smoke 2 packs a day.
Oh
So
my golly. Oh, wow.
after I stopped running in high school. And apparently it didn't have too much effect on my ability level. But when I got my first AIDS test, and that was in agony because I was kept waiting about 30 minutes in this little booth because the woman who was announcing the news to various people had to tell somebody who was positive, and the person broke down and she needed to comfort him. But in any case, when I got my first test and I was negative, I thought, well, that's good. And now I thought, I will have to stop smoking because I can no longer say that my life is going to be over very soon. I should make some effort to stop it. And my closest friend, who's straight, said exactly the same thing to me when I told him that, and I stopped smoking. So so the testing actually proved to be very beneficial. I didn't start running till much later.
So my question to you, Andrew, is because you were in that AIDS situation and you had a former person that you were physical with that got AIDS and died, did you think that in the back of your mind that you may die of AIDS at that time?
Oh, yes. I was very worried about it. At that time, every time I had a bruise on my body that I couldn't explain, I would wonder if it wasn't Kaposi sarcoma. Anytime I had a long cold with congestion and that didn't seem healthy, I would wonder whether this was just the onset of the disease. So, yeah, I think everybody during that first period uh, worried a whole lot. I certainly restricted my behavior to tried to keep it to a minimum, one person or one partner. But, it's not always so easy to just order that. And so I never felt very confident. It wasn't until they started developing various therapies that I felt like I could breathe again, really, and felt a lot safer about sexuality. So it was a long, long haul. We're talking about over a decade, almost 15 years, I guess, before the therapies were developed. So it was a really terrible period. Part of my response, my academic response, was to teach a comparative literature course on AIDS to try to address the subject there. And as I mentioned to you the other day, I had begun in a different program teaching on LBGT history. At that time, it was gay and lesbian history. And so I was trying to move forward with a lot of subjects. And with the latter, I really tried to teach to a broader perspective of history, not just about AIDS, because I felt we were being, as a community, reduced to a disease, and there was so much more to us and so much more interesting. So I sort of navigated all this through through that period. But I must say, the early '80s into almost the late '80s was a time of acute anguish and fear.
Yeah.
But rational fear of catching a disease and dying, not some kind of hysterical.
Mm-hmm. Well, and they've certainly made a lot of progress on that stage. But back then, they didn't even know for a period of time what really caused it. They didn't know how it was spread. There were all different types of rumors I remember them thinking, can you get it from a drinking fountain? Can you get it if somebody touches you? I mean, there was all types of ridiculous. Well, they weren't. All types of things that people were getting hyper about that wasn't the cause of it. Does that make sense?
That makes tremendous sense. I worried initially if I hugged my nieces and nephews, would I be killing them? I considered I thought about all of those things and realized that, it really required a great deal of contact. But initially I was very wary. And I think almost everyone was. And I also was very concerned that politically it would be used as a tool for persecution
against the gay people.
Yeah, well, wasn't it William Buckley, that odious snob, who suggested that gay people be branded or tattooed, as potential AIDS carriers or something like that. So there were talk of putting people aside in what would have been concentration camps. And there's a lot to be fearful about. And in this case, this was not imaginary fear, but real. The interesting thing, though, I think about the AIDS crisis is that it brought the community, both the gay and lesbian community, together in such great solidarity, because in the 70s, the gay community and the lesbian community were more or less going their separate ways with very different agendas. Lesbians were understandably revolting against the sexism of all males, including us, and gay guys were having a great party. I mean, I enjoyed the 70s thoroughly. But if you would, the 80s brought us together. And it actually created a lot of allies and a lot of openness in discussion, that the silver lining of AIDS, and I would never want to go through it just to attain this, but nonetheless, the silver lining of AIDS was, I think, stronger community, greater openness, and actually ultimately political progress. So out of a great catastrophe, some good had emerged, but at the cost of so many lives and so many people I knew who would be alive today and who would be part of my cohort and whose voices and comments and faces I miss very much.
I understand that. But we also come from a lot of, I think another gift that gives us is humility. It brings us a humility to understand that we're very precious if we are alive, and many of our community are not. So that is, I think, a quality of humility and humility and understanding. So we make sure, and I can see your point where it does kind of bring you closer together. Crisis does that with people. Sometimes it brings them closer together. And I think in this case, that was what happened. So let's just talk about this today, about activity and running and keeping yourself in good shape, because I'm such a fan of, I work out 5-6 times a week after over 40 some years. I probably am addicted to exercise. I mean, come on, I've been addicted to other things, so it must be that too. I just love the extra. I love the way I feel emotionally, physically, and spiritually. And you and I talked about it, Andrew, and share the thoughts, because I think both of us agree with that, don't we?
I think probably so. I am wary of using the word addicted, though. I think working hard, even working yourself to death, sometimes achieves things that moderation would never achieve. And
that's a nice way of finding it.
And I'm not sure that in that sense I would reproach it. And the same thing with exercise. It's just something I need to do. Addiction, I'll leave that to smoking and drinking. And I haven't smoked in about more than a quarter of a century. But those are fearful, and they control you, and nothing good comes of them. But other things, extreme behavior can actually move the world forward. So addiction I use very selectively. I use it.
I have to make a comment here, because you made me think of something. I used work addiction at my worst. I was 90 hours a week, and I was traveling all over the world, making lots of money, loved what I did. And it's easier. People seem to have an easier time with work addiction than they do with drug addiction or alcohol addiction. But it also is an addiction for me, because I was burying who I was. And the more I was thinking about who I was and my issues with being a gay man, the more I worked my tail off. So, but it's an addiction that most people accept.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, and exercise is the same way. People accept addiction of exercise and workaholisms, and even some religious addiction they accept. But you get into the drugs and the smoking and the alcohol, it's not as acceptable. So I agree with what you're saying.
Okay, well, I like to persist in my athletic endeavors, and for my work. When I first arrived at my last job, which lasted for several decades, I had a lot of work to do because my department was very small. It was in in very bad shape, and I soon became chair, and I had to do many, many things and had to focus on doing that. I didn't mind focusing on it, and I was happy with the results that my colleagues and I were able to attain. We did very well, but it would have been nice to have a little more free time for myself and to spend some more time on my personal life that I didn't do. But I wasn't doing this so much as for trying to forget who I was. And in my case, it was making sure I still had a job and that I was working somewhere where I liked to work and there'll be something. So I don't mind that addiction at all. And I don't want to call it an addiction. I would call it my commitment, but perhaps an excessive one. And for running, I don't know. I mean, it's just something I do. I like to do. And if I don't do it, I don't feel very good. I go to the gym too, but I'm not a gym rat. I actually don't like gyms, but I feel I need to do it to keep myself from falling apart. So I go.
Well, and I think it's good, and I think both of us agree that exercise is it helps you emotionally, spiritually, and physically. And what I've always said about exercise: find an exercise that you like. You know, some people like to do bicycling. That's not my thing. Swimming, I can swim, but it's not my thing. You know, find something you really like. Mine is right now, it's pickleball. I'm addicted to pickleball. I play 3 times a week. Mm-hmm. I would play every day. It's great exercise. It's competitive for me. I feel better emotionally, physically, and even spiritually. And like you and I were talking yesterday, Andrew, when we're not doing that for 2 or 3 days, we don't feel we are who we are. In this sense, I mean, I'm sluggish. I don't feel good. You know, I'm dragging my butt around, and that doesn't happen very often. But I just feel better. I take 1 day off a week, but and I need that. I need that day off. It's good for me to have a day off, even 2 days off. They say 3 to 5 times a week is what all of us need to do. But anyway, I think you and I are kind of on the same page on that. It's been such a pleasure talking with you, but I want to ask you about. I mean, you're such a courageous person, and because I am physically oriented and I love working out and love doing physical things, when I see somebody who's 77 years old and ran 3 marathons, one when he was 76 and 2 when he was 77, and he's going to run the Chicago Marathon, my hat's off to you. My hat's off to you, Andrew. You're a role model for me. Even though we're similar age, you're a role model for me. But let me ask you, because we're going to have many different people listening to our podcast there. And we talk about if somebody's struggling with who they are, or they want to exercise, but they're not doing it yet. What would be some things that you would say that your life story may help them to be able to make their life more complete? Is there anything you would say?
If in terms of exercise or in terms of
let's leave it wide open. Exercise or their sexual preferences. There's still people that are hiding in the closet.
Well, I think people should think about try to understand what they really want, because that's often the hardest thing to figure out in life. And we often don't tell ourselves, well, we're not brave enough to tell ourselves that we want one thing or another. And as a result, we never sort of embark on the journey to that would enable us to realize our goals. And so I think the first thing is to think about what one wants, and then to just approach it very modestly. If somebody wants to run, they should just start walking or jogging as much as they want, and they can leave it at that. If it's if it's their sexuality, they should sort of seek other people who could counsel them, who can give them some kind of support, and who can enable them to move forward with a degree of confidence. They should, another thing in changing or moving towards something you seek is to get information, which is very important. Read, go on the web, go on the internet, do whatever is necessary to find, really sort of situate yourself in a particular context and get an idea of where you can go. And also, I think one shouldn't get discouraged easily. You just need to do what you want to do or what you figured out you want to do, and to just be open to things, because I started running again out of sheer accident, just because I thought I was getting too fat. So I had no intentions of competing, and I thought I would be quite slow. So I was very surprised when I started, especially after all of my years of smoking. I didn't expect to be a serious contender for anything. But, once I got into a little bit of running, I got once I started winning or placing in races, that sort of created a whole new scenario that engaged me, and that probably wouldn't have happened if I just didn't start running again. And so I think with many activities, it's the same way. You start doing something and you find you really like it, or you're very good at it, and that leads you onward. In terms of sexuality and that, it's something people need to act upon, because time goes by and things don't happen. And you also have to be willing to take risks, because we fail at a lot of things. We're disappointed with a number of things, but that's human. And you can't move forward without coping with that sort of situation. And, in business or anything, there are times when things don't go well, and you have to figure out what you did wrong and move forward. I always like to blame myself when I have a project and it doesn't work out. And I find that blaming myself is empowering. It may sound ironic, but instead of saying, "Oh, this went wrong," or "that one wasn't cooperative," et cetera, if I blame myself, I keep my agency. I'm still in charge. If I see the problems as coming from outside, then I'm just a victim who's a hapless creature who's going to be buffeted by the force of circumstances. That might be true, but it's better to view things as to view failures in that as one's own fault, because then one can resolve the issue.
And I think you made a comment that I think is so important. Regardless of whether it's exercise or it's our sexuality, I think we need a community. I think for several reasons, a community, if it's exercise, you're someone that you're going to be committed to. You're committed to a community. You're going to be at front runners at a certain time. It's a commitment to a community. And I think community is so important for any human being. They need a community that will support them, that won't judge them. They need to be inclusive with them. And I think that's so, so important. Also with exercise and identifying a community. And that's one of the things that when I came out and lost my whole family, except my daughter, I needed a community. I lost my whole community. And so that's when I started finding front runners and several other organizations that became my community of choice, not my community of blood. And I think that was powerful for me. And I am such a believer in community.
I would strongly agree with that. And I would say, in terms of running, which is a kind of very special community organization, when I was inducted into the Chicago Hall of Fame, I had to give a little talk. And what I emphasized was, I said, I hadn't realized when I joined CARA, that's the acronym for it, that I was really joining one of the world's most effective affinity groups, because it immediately linked me up with all sorts of people who shared similar goals and shared in similar activities, and that it's very difficult to find that kind of instant friendship and camaraderie everywhere. And I know specifically with the front runners because I've been part of them for over a quarter of a century in Chicago, but also in Paris, where I used to run with the group during the summer. And of course in San Diego and Palm Springs. Those provided instant communities. In France, I knew a lot of people from work. So I had a whole community of friends in Paris. When I started running with front runners, I doubled or tripled that community. And a lot of my American academic friends would say to me, how do you know so many people? And it was, in fact, this really wonderful resource, and which is hard to match. There are other things. Like I have friends whose parents were violinists, and they used to go to these groups to play together when they travel throughout the world. But I think if you have common interests, and especially for gay people, if you like to run or walk, something like Front Runners is an excellent way to have an instant community. Very
excellent. I totally agree with that. Andrew, you've been such a pleasure for me to be able to spend time with you and talk about your life and your incredible career running. And I want to say something. You're running the Chicago Marathon in October of this year, right?
Right.
I'm going to be cheering for you. I won't be running with you by no means, but I will be cheering from you. And my hat's off to you. You've been very courageous in your life. You've done so many things that many of us won't get the opportunity to be able to do. For example, being a marathon runner. So thank you so much for spending the time with me. Congratulations on your wonderful running career. I'm not going to ask you how long you're going to run because I think you told me as long as the body holds up, right? Okay. Thank you so much, Andrew. It's been my pleasure. And thank you for being able to show us some courage that you took to be courageous.
Well, you're very welcome. And thank you very much for interviewing me.
Okay. Take care. Bye-bye now.
Bye.